Can I actually, following on from both Judith Popovic's remarks and Camille Kilnunen's, actually, what we have to establish is an undeniable truth, is that human rights are a universal right, and that any erosion of those rights in any place, it deserves and must have the condemnation. So I very much welcome what Judith was saying to us before about the position here in Serbia, a recognition that things are still taking place that are unacceptable, and it's a determination to root those out. Because in the end, the legal base may sound very boring, very technical, but unless we've got that legal floor through which we insist people should not drop, then it's at times of crisis when things go wrong. It's at times, like in Kyrgyzstan, when huge levels of civil disturbance took place, that we find that people resort to torture. Or, as I'll say later on, even in countries that would regard themselves as being immune from these pressures, we know that torture has been allowed to take place. A few years back, Amnesty International published what they talked about as a 12-point plan to combat torture in national jurisdictions. Now, I won't run through point by point, but I'll just comment generally and say this. It's actually a very sensible framework for people to use, because it talks about, first of all, the need for torture to be condemned at the highest possible level in the state. Kimmo Kiljunen made the point that the president in Kyrgyzstan condemns these practices, and that is an important first step. There's got to be a legal framework, actually, that does bear down against torture, and a legal framework that does a number of things, that insists that where evidence of torture takes place, that is both investigated and prosecuted. But part of that legal framework has also got to look at the training of those involved, the police, those in our prisons, in our penal institutions, and part of that training has got to point out to those involved that they have both a right and a duty to refuse to act on an order to engage in torture. It's absolutely fundamental that people are trained to know that they have that right and they have that duty. Otherwise, these things take place when we don't know about them, and even with the best prosecution system, we cannot prosecute unless we know what's taking place. And of course, that really is one of the other important elements of what Andy's talked about, is the need for us to know what is taking place, which means there has to be access from those held in detention to their own relatives, their own families, their friends, and of course to legal representation. That's not just at the point of initial arrest, it also must continue throughout that process of detention, even for those who are convicted of the most serious crimes. There has to be access to some control, some complaint system that will give them in turn proper access, because it's only with that kind of publicity that we can bring pressure to bear on those involved in these most outrageous of practices. What I think is a little bit missing from the Amnesty 12-point plan are two other things, though, which I think are absolutely fundamentally important. And one is actually the development and the acceptance that without NGOs acting in this area, it is very difficult for us as societies to challenge our own authorities. We need active NGOs who engage in these things, people who, if you like, are obsessive in these issues at times that the rest of us simply want to read a book or watch a football match or whatever it may be. We do need obsessive NGOs out there working away to deliver this information. And the other thing, of course, we do need a media that's prepared to follow these issues and treat them with importance, because Better referred earlier on to the situation in Russia. One of the problems in Russia, frankly, is that the press isn't free enough to make report on what takes place. It's more likely I know in Britain what takes place in Russia than that many Russians know what's taking place in Russia. Now, I don't want to single out Russia because, as I'm going to say, I could point the finger at many different countries, this broken promise in the OSCE area. Most of the countries in the OSCE are potentially culpable at some point recently. I just want to refer to a few examples, which in some senses are, I think, are quite shocking, because the it's easy for somebody from Western Europe to point the finger at Kyrgyzstan, to point the finger at Uzbekistan, to point the finger even at Russia, where we know practices that are outrageous take place. It's more difficult sometimes for people in countries like mine to look in the mirror rather than looking at other people. But there are some cases recently. One of my friends is a guy who will be actually speaking at another meeting tomorrow. Dick Marty is a Swiss Member of Parliament. He did quite a lot of work in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe on what became known as extraordinary rendition, and many people in this audience will probably know about this. But I just want to cite a number of the cases that came out and about. And they're a few years ago, each of these, but nevertheless still illustrative. There's the case of Abu Omar, who was a Muslim priest living in Milan. And in 2003, he was picked up, almost certainly by the CIA. He was transported, first of all, from Milan to Germany, and then from Germany he was transported to Cairo, where, again, all the evidence supports his own claims that he suffered torture in Egypt. So in other words, he was picked up on the streets of a Western European city, transported to another Western European city, then onto Egypt for the purpose of him being tortured. In fact, the Italian Justice Minister at the time, even though the courts issued extradition warrants for the arrest of the CIA operatives, the Italian Justice Minister didn't make that request to the United States authorities. Now, at any level, that is complicity of two governments who would normally say to themselves that they are above and beyond this allegation that they conspire in torture. There was the case of Majid Mohammed Abu Ahmed, who was in 2005. He was already in Guantanamo Bay. Now, actually in Guantanamo Bay, we know that waterboarding and these activities had taken place. What's less certain is where they took place. And the official presumption is that actually at Guantanamo itself, torture may not have taken place. However, in this particular case of this individual, his lawyers managed to obtain a redacted document, a document with bits taken out from the American Department of Defense, which made it quite clear that they were considering sending Ahmed to an unspecified foreign country that employed torture. Now, in other words, we torture by proxy. We don't torture ourselves, we ask other people to do this on our behalf. Now, again, this is the United States. Now, it's the American legal system that stopped this taking place, let me say in fairness. It was American lawyers who took the Department of Defense to court and stopped that. Or an even more astonishing case, actually, of Amar, who was a dual Canadian-Syrian national. And in 2002, he was travelling back from a family holiday in Tunisia and flew through Kennedy Airport in the United States. He was arrested, he was stopped at the airport, he was transmitted from the United States to Syria, where he was systematically tortured over a period of time and signed a confession, but a confession for things that everybody knows now he didn't have any need to confess to, but torture, of course, makes us all good witnesses. And in 2007, the American House of Representatives issued an apology to this individual. They refused to pay compensation in passing, but that's maybe not the biggest issue. They did. However, one member of Congress who did take part in the collective apology did say, nevertheless, that he didn't feel it was right to discontinue this practice. Now, the final point I really want to make then is one that comes from this, because if you take that particular case, somebody being picked up, he was a Canadian national, dual Canadian national, picked up from a family holiday, whisked back to his country of birth, but one that he had not spent recent time in, tortured and was willing to give a confession. Now, that confession would have been used, presumably, potentially, in evidence against what? Against others, against himself, wherever. And back to the Amnesty 12-point plan, one of the most fundamental things that we do have to insist on is that evidence obtained under torture can never, ever be used legitimately in a court of law, because of all forms of evidence, it's the most unreliable. The very final point I'll make is this, is that many of us have lived through different dilemmas. It is the dilemma when you're told that somebody knows about the person who's going to place a bomb in the room full of school children, and almost common sense says, do we not resort to torture at that point? Because that's the moral dilemma we face. What I would say to you is this, is that we know actually that doing these things under torture is quite likely to have those children killed and innocents tortured and those who are guilty simply escaping all processes. So an insistence on a legal base, an insistence actually on a human moral base for the way we conduct these things is fundamental. So that 12-point plan with NGOs, with publicity, I think is what we've got to insist on throughout the OSCE area. And every one of us has to go home to our own countries and say, could this happen here? And answer the question, yes it could, unless we're prepared to shine the sunlight of publicity is the only way of cleaning up all our countries.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd, and we appreciate it.